The 2017 Super Duty is a sight to behold straight from the factory. However, throw a 4-inch lift at it and it becomes an entirely new beast. Not only will a BDS 4-inch radius arm lift kit eliminate front rake and lift your ride to an appropriate height, but you'll also be able to squeeze on larger wheels and tires, making your Super Duty even more capable and aggressive looking. Featuring vastly improved radius arms, this is one of the more dependable and well-made lift kits on the market. The arms feature factory-style 3¼ inch rubber bushings, which help to minimize road vibrations and prolong bushing life. The assembly bolts right into the factory mounting points, positioning the front axle to the correct caster angle, complete with high-quality ProRYDE coil springs, an NX2 series steering stabilizer, and your choice of high-performance shocks. Nothing can stop you from going where you want to go once your 17 Super Duty is equipped with this awesome 4-inch lift kit. We'll begin this lengthy installation with the front suspension, so remove the wheels and place a jack stand under the front axle. Our transmission jack ended up working perfectly for this. Now unbolt the front shocks to start the removal process. Next, we unbolted the sway bar from the frame mounts and swung it down. We also removed our old sway bar drop brackets that were installed from a previous leveling kit. Now the brake line bracket can be detached from the spring perch as well as the upper brake line bracket from the frame. Here we also had a previous drop bracket installed. Remove the bump stop by pulling out the bushing and unscrewing the mount from the frame. Yet again, since we had a leveling kit installed, our removal was different. Now the track bar can be unbolted from its driver's side mount and left to hang for now. Moving on to the steering stabilizer and drag link, remove the cotter pin on the shaft that inserts into the pitman arm, as well as the bolt cap. Then unbolt the drag link from the pitman arm and separate the two. We needed to pry the drag link off with air tools since it's tightly attached to the pitman arm. We now remove the stock track bar bracket in order to replace it with the new unit. The 3 inline bolts will be removed as well as the 2 bolts on the underside of the frame near the suspension. These 2 bolts use flag nuts through access holes in the frame, so be careful not to lose them. We now made sure any brake lines or vacuum lines were removed from their clips to allow us to sag the front axle as we needed. Now we can pull the stock springs out of the truck. Unbolt the stock pitman arm with a 1 13/16 inch socket. Hopefully you have access to air tools here. This nut will put up a fight. Now using a puller tool, we remove the stock pitman arm from the steering box. Then install the new pitman arm in its place using the stock nut. We moved on to the radius arms next by removing the 3 bolts that hold it to the frame and axle. The new BDS arms bolt directly in place of the old arms. They have alignment spacers, and detailed instructions on their orientation can be found in the BDS instructions. It is important to note to only replace 1 radius arm at a time to help prevent axle movement. We then moved on to the bump stop extensions by bolting the bushing plate to the extension. Use the alignment tab to set it in properly. The bushing will then push back into the plate and the extension can be bolted back onto the frame. To install the brake line drop brackets, we need to reinstall the upper bracket to hold it in place. Pull out the clip from the underside of the bracket because the bracket needs to be cut from the brake lines. Just be careful not to trim the lines themselves. Place the new drop bracket into the frame, then bend the brake lines to fit them in their new location on the bracket. The retaining clip from the stock bracket will be reinstalled onto the brake lines. We now tackled the sway bar drop bracket by attaching it to the bolts in the frame. Then slide the new hardware through the bracket. Next up, the new track bar bracket can be installed along with the new stabilizer mount in between the track bar bracket and the frame. Remember the spacer that is installed between the frame and the front mount. Also be careful with the flag nuts inside the frame. Lower the axle back down to prepare for the new springs. Transfer the isolator to the new lift spring, then install the spring into the truck, making sure it is properly aligned in the lower mount. The axle can then be raised back up to seat the spring. Then bolt the lower brake line bracket into the spring perch. Set up the front shocks by greasing up the mounts and installing the bushings. The grease will help to prevent unwanted suspension noise. In the lower mount of the front springs, we use the larger diameter of the two sleeves. The top of the shock will get its plate and bushing on each side of the mount. We found it easier to install the lower shock mount first, then compress the shock to slide it into the upper mount. Reinstallation of the track bar can get tricky since the axle has shifted during disassembly. Using straps, we pulled the axle over to its correct location and mounted the track bar onto its new mount in the bracket. There are also alignment tabs that will be installed here. Once the track bar is torqued down, you can remove the strap. Next up, we have the sway bar that can now be bolted up to its drop bracket we installed earlier. The factory steering stabilizer will not be reused, so we unbolted it from the upper mount and its mount in the drag link and set it aside. Unbolt the bracket from the drag link to be able to access the adjustment on the end. Loosen the two adjustment bolts and rotate the drag link 180 degrees to install it through the bottom of the new pitman arm. Attach the factory nut and replace the cap with the new cotter pin. We chose not to reuse the bracket, so we cut it off of the drag link. Now reattach the axle vent line if you needed to remove it earlier to lower the axle. Set up the new steering stabilizer by installing the bushings as well as installing the upper mounting bolt onto the bracket. Slide the shock onto the upper mount and tighten the nut. Center the steering wheel and extend the steering stabilizer to 4.5 to 4 3/4 inches. Then mark on the drag link where the new bracket will mount. The bracket can mount either way on the drag link. We chose to mount the U-bolts under the shock and trim off the excess for a cleaner look. Then bolt the shock onto the mount. This completes our front lift installation, so double check all of your installed hardware to make sure everything is correctly installed, and we can move on to the rear suspension. After removing the rear wheels, we set up a pull jack under the side of the axle we are working on, and unbolted the upper and lower shock mounts to remove the shock from the truck. Set up the new shocks with their grease, bushings, and sleeves. Before installing the shocks, we tackled the rear blocks by removing the U-bolts and axle plate. It is important to unbolt these U-bolts evenly so there are no mishaps on removal. Also, only work on one side of the axle at a time. After the plate is off, pull the U-bolts off of the leaf pack. Now lower the pull jack to remove the stock rear block and replace it with a new and larger block. Slide on the new longer U-bolts along with the stock plate and attach the new hardware. The same as removal. Tighten the 4 nuts evenly. We will wait to fully torque them down until the entire rear install is completed. Install the new rear shock in its lower mount, then compress the top to slide it onto the upper mount. Then tighten the shock to the upper and lower mounts. With both sides completed, we can fully torque down the U-bolts to the axle, and our lift kit installation is finished. After installation of a BDS 4-inch lift kit on our 2017 Super Duty, we took to some snowy off-road trails to put it to the test. With the extra clearance and bigger 35-inch tires, we had no issue tackling any of the trails we put it through. Likewise, the street ride on this kit is also very good. We chose the upgraded Fox front and rear shocks, and it sure was worth the initial investment. They handle this big and heavy truck no problem and deliver a comfortable street ride with improved handling over stock.